Welcome back, everybody. I hope you all had a great lunch. We are now going to have a really fantastic keynote conversation with Aaron Saltman, who's done a lot of great work involved with both the GIFCT and also in helping to stand up this research consortium as well. And she has graciously agreed to come on stage, and we're going to have a bit of an informal conversation. We'll chat for about 20-25 minutes or so, and then open it up to audience Q&A. I imagine I could talk to all afternoon with Aaron, but I imagine many of you in this audience have questions as well. So let's get started. I was wondering if you could actually do a bit of level setting about what Facebook in particular, with your Facebook hat on, what the current state of play is in terms of what Facebook is doing. The reason I ask, I imagine many of the folks in this room have had this experience as well. When you have a discussion around issues related to tech and terrorism, let's say you have an hour-long roundtable or panel, the first half hour is just trying to get everybody in line among what is actually the state of play now, because at first it'll be, I can't believe the platforms aren't doing anything, and then somebody will say, well, no, they actually are doing some stuff now. It's not 4 years ago. ISIS isn't just running rampant. And then somebody else will say, yeah, but they're just using AI, and that's bad because they're only using AI. And then someone else will say, well, that's also not quite what they're doing. And so before the conversation can even kind of move to a place where you have a constructive dialogue about what needs to happen, you have to do a lot of level setting around just what the current, what is currently happening within the tech companies themselves and what their current policies are. So I was wondering if you could just start off by offering a few comments on that.
Okay. A few comments. Yeah, we could. So I think we've come a long way, and I think that's a starting point. And as anyone knows that deals with countering terrorism, whether that's in a tech field or academia, there's no point, unfortunately, I wish it were true, where I could come to you and say, Facebook's got it, don't worry, no terrorism ever, we've solved it. That'd be great. I'd get a lot of promotion and also be out of a job, but that's just not the case. As we said, the threat evolves, we evolve, and that includes things like the policy evolving. So I'm on the Counterterrorism and Dangerous Organizations policy team. And there's 5 of us, hopefully expanding a little more, but we're based in different parts of the world to feed back on policy lines, because when we set a policy, it's global. So we started, Brian Fishman is my boss based at headquarters in California. He wrote ISIS, the Master Plan. I'll plug his book there because it's incredible, because he started about 3 years ago and I started just after him to be based in London to cover Europe, Middle East, and Africa, whereas he's based in California to cover headquarter kind of analysis around things. And the first questions that we were posing ourselves is, we say in our terms of service that we counter terrorism. We work in lots of different parts of the world, increasingly almost all of the world. And if we don't have our own definition of what we consider terrorism, then really we leave it up to any government to say, remove this for terrorism. And we're coming from a Western bias to think that that always hits a safe level marker. I can tell you right now in some parts of the world what they're flagging is journalist content, or an opposition party, or an activist network, or it could be part of a civil war, and it's really hard to know what groups are part of it. So about almost 2 years ago, Facebook actually produced its definition of terrorism. And I know our friends at ICT and others, there's never going to be a perfect definition that Facebook comes up with that the world will say, oh, you've solved this one as well. None of our governments could agree, but you've got this. But we have to go off of behavioral indicators. So our definition has to be religiously and ideologically agnostic, but we're looking at things like premeditated violence. We're looking at what the target is. We're looking at the fact that the violence is intended for a political or ideological purpose. So it's mostly in line, and some of the people in this room fed into our definition and have continued the dialogues with us. We got a lot of academic feedback. And it was so that we could put something forward so that if somebody said, remove this for terrorism, and it's not terrorism, we can hold it to account and say, that's not terrorism, here's why. Or when we see a group evolve or we see violence come out, we can say, we are going to label that as terrorism. We don't have to wait for an official OFAC definition or reinstatement on a UN or US list, which we refer to. We refer to all of those lists, but as we know about processes to put entities on that list, it's very hard. The other thing we had to make sure is that we can be nimble about not just identifying orgs, so organizational terrorist groups, but we can also label something as terrorism at the event level or at the entity, individual level. And that's really important when we talk about terrorist attacks like what happened in Christchurch, where you have, increasingly with white supremacy, you have a terrorist attacker that is not officially part of a terrorist organization. But we also have definitions around hate-based organizations. You don't have to be violent to be kicked off of Facebook. So entities that might be legal in a jurisdiction like the KKK go against our hate-based organizational policies. So that's, one is we have a definition. And then two is we have to check, where can we find tech solves? Where do we need human expertise? And where do we need partnerships? And there's not a black and white. So it was mentioned by UCL presentation and Nick Gill about the fact that, oftentimes we have triage between tech and human expertise, and that's really important. So, for example, when it comes to terrorism, we have things like photo and video matching technology. So when we know about a piece of official propaganda, we can bank it so that any subsequent upload of that is caught. But we also have things like recidivism work. So we learned from things like spam technology. The photo and video matching, we learned from abuse areas like child exploitation imagery. So that's where that first came into being. So we're learning from other abuse types. And we also do things like fanning out. So anyone that studies radicalization realizes that we can debate the lone wolf phenomena, but oftentimes this is not in a total isolated echo chamber. It's a network. There is a group of people, offline or online, that radicalize. So we also do network analysis, whereby if an account comes down for terrorist activity, machine learning can look for identification markers about violating content all these people shared or the network of how they were communicating and surface that group and triage it for human review. So a lot is about what can a machine take down in a binary decision process. So if you are raw uploading known terrorist content without context or being shared with known hashtags that support a terrorist group, a machine can take the binary decision to remove that. However, if you're sharing terrorist content and there's context that needs to be reviewed, it will triage that to the human review team. And that's where we get things like, if an Al Jazeera article or BBC article might use the front cover of the last Daesh publication just to highlight a story, that's not illegal. In fact, that's just widely known. So we would review and say, okay, that's not praise and support and representation of terrorism. That's actually condemnation or newsworthy, and that would stay up. So it's not as black and white as areas like child exploitation, where any share of that content is explicitly illegal. There is nuance that we needed to build in with the triage between human and machine at Facebook. And quickly, and I'll go back to you, is the result of something like that in the last year. For example, in 2018, we took down, I think, 19 million pieces of terrorist content. And that sounds crazy large, because that is ridiculously large. But we also need to question numbers. So if tech companies tell you numbers, you need the qualitative reasons behind that, because that just sounds like we are rife with terrorism. But the majority of some of those number takedowns were because, one, we got the machine learning better at going back in time to finding old content that was posted maybe 5 years ago, but that we hadn't triggered or found before. So that's huge, because that doesn't mean it was new content. A lot of it was old content. And then the second is we got better at enforcing our policy on things like Messenger. So again, these are on Facebook, Messenger, Instagram, and WhatsApp is also part of our family of apps. And so numbers alone don't tell you the full picture. But those are the areas where we've evolved a lot, I think, in the last couple of years.
So first of all, I want to thank you for the transparency around the numbers, and even just coming on stage now, right? I mean, it's I think. I meant to say this in my opening remarks, but I think one of the, there has been a fair amount of tension, I guess you could say, between academia and policy audiences or policy community on one side, and then some of the tech companies on another. And it's great to be able to have a format like this where we can engage directly. And I guess one of the questions I would have around, let's just stick with transparency for right now. What are the tensions that you face internally? Because I think one of the things that, for those of us on the outside, we would all love to see more transparency, right? We know that there's that 19 million number, but to get to, I think Paul made a comment earlier about base rates, right? It's hard to understand what that is if you don't have the broader number for all content. And I think a lot of us would love to see even more transparency. But as we ask for it, what are the constraints that you all face within your organizations that even if you wanted to provide a little bit more transparency, just would block you from doing that?
I do think that, at least for Facebook, but I know some of the bigger companies have all started putting a model together where at least once a year you have a transparency report. And I think Facebook is working towards making that happen quarterly. I think we do it every 6 months currently, and I think our next transparency report is coming out imminently. And that includes a lot of different things. So in our transparency report, it not only tells you about terrorist takedowns, but also takedowns around hate speech and spam and pornography. And it can tell you there's a lot more spam and pornography on platforms than terrorism. But to get the context right, we also have to talk through things like the rate of appeals. And I think that's something that we're trying to get put into the transparency reports. Because about a year ago, you could always appeal if your profile was removed and you think it was removed erroneously. But we upped the level of appeal process to make sure that even if a piece of content comes down, you can appeal that decision. And it would go back and have a double review of other people, and they'd have much more context to look at the nature of that content. And that, I think, is really important, because then we can get to a baseline of how many of our community are flagging that we got it wrong, and when they flag that we got it wrong, how much did we actually get it wrong? I mean, a lot of people just say that should be up there, especially in the hate org space or hate speech. They feel they have the right to perhaps use that sort of dehumanizing language or targeting, which is against our policy. So it also talks through how many people appealed based on that 19 million number, and then how much of that actually was successfully then reinstated. Sometimes those numbers are high, because if we feel that we got one piece of content wrong, so if somebody flags that we got a piece of content wrong, I'll give you a really silly example. You see a lot of stuff in the terrorist content space. Everyone thinks that it's all beheading videos. There's some weird stuff out there. And one of the big false positives that we got recently, and I know Dean and I had to sit there and like, I cannot believe our jobs include this, ISIS loo roll, ISIS toilet paper. Now it's just an image, and it's of the ISIS flag on a roll of toilet paper. Is that counter speech? Is that satire? Is ISIS actually branding toilet paper? Is this praise and support of terrorism? And we have to watch the really horrific stuff too, so we all need counseling. But you get something like ISIS toilet paper, and you're just like, that's hard. Are people glorifying terrorism, or is this obvious satire? And so we had to go back and be like, this is satire. People are mocking. This is not inherently, I don't want to strike someone's account for sharing satirical toilet paper memes. It's really weird. So if we make the decision that that is not, in fact, propagating terrorism, then it only takes that one person to appeal to get that right for all of that content to be reinstated. So it wouldn't take everybody flagging us that we got it wrong. That would en masse. So some of those numbers would shoot up, not because even the person appealed it every time, but that, okay, that piece of content we got wrong, so let's reinstate en masse around it.
I want to shift gears slightly. You had mentioned tech solves.
You don't want to talk about ISIS toilet paper all day?
Well, I would be glad to. First of all, show of hands, should it come down or stay up? Or is it hate speech? All right, I could indulge that conversation, but let's move on a bit to some solutions, right? So you have the ISIS toilet paper problem, but then there's also some technical problems, and then also some policy problems. And I want to start with just two of the potential tech solutions that are out there. We can kind of treat them in turn. One would be greater reliance on machine learning, and the other kind of switching from open protocols to more private or encrypted ones. I guess I would push you to, or ask you to talk a little bit more about the potential for AI and machine learning to play more of a role in content moderation. I know when Zuckerberg testified before Congress, I think it was last spring, he kind of pointed to that as, don't worry, we got this, we're going to have some great AI, and I'd be curious for your thoughts on the role that AI and machine learning can play vis-a-vis human moderators, and when that handoff should happen, and what kind of appeals or oversight should be in place.
Okay, so I think there's a lot of terms that get used in the tech world very haphazardly, not least, the internet. So the internet means a million things, but when we talk about things like artificial intelligence and machine learning, or if the word algorithm gets thrown around, oftentimes, and rightfully so, it's confusing. We're not actually digging into, well, what is an algorithm? Or what is artificial intelligence? A lot of tools we use aren't actually artificial intelligence, but are very helpful. So photo and video matching, the machine is not saying, based on this, I think this is also an image. This is saying this is a direct match. So that's not about a machine making an just random haphazard decision. That's saying we have a direct match with a known piece of violating content, and within that we can put some gradation around fuzzy matching. But we also see that there's no silver bullet, even for that. So let's talk about New Zealand. Facebook came out with a statement that the first 24 hours after the New Zealand terrorist attack, we removed 1.5 million pieces of content shared around the attack, either the perpetrator video or clips of it or the manifesto. 1.2 million of that was caught automatically from the machine and removed, so it never hit the surface. But that also means that you have about 300,000 pieces in the first 24 hours that did make it through. And people are like, but you could match. We saw an aggressive cross-functional attempt at making that content go viral. So we were being told by other intelligence community that people were handing out tips and tech solves for how to manipulate, change, and edit the video so that it could be re-uploaded to share while evading our matching technology. So that's changing pixelation, putting color gradation on it, somebody screenshotting or videoing it off the computer. We saw an audible version come out of it within a few hours where it was just audio. So we had to apply audio matching. And then I know we talked with Twitter around it, and they said over 70% of the virality of the video came from verified accounts. So that's not terrorist sympathizers. That was coming out from mainstream media, verified people that were just interested. They weren't supporting it. In fact, many times they were condemning it. But we also made the really robust decision to remove any and all shares of the content because of New Zealand law enforcement requesting that. Meaning we removed all of it and took the decision not to strike against accounts, because actually the amount of it being shared that was actually praising and supporting the attack was minimal compared to a weird range of just curiosity or media, sometimes gore enthusiasts. There's some weird subsects. That should also always come down. But we saw this huge push and virality and aggressive nature to try to get this content out there. That's not normal. I can tell you right now, analysis-wise, that went further and penetrated faster than any one piece of ISIS content I've ever looked at. And I look at a lot of terrorist content. So when you talk about tech fixes, there are things that are not artificial intelligence, like photo and video matching. There's no silver bullet, so you can employ fuzzy matching, where we can say, okay, it's about 10% difference or 20% difference. If you get too fuzzy, you're just looking at different content, and then that gets into the free speech realm, text overlay of condemnation and things like that. But we're constantly toying with that. There are things like text analysis, which maybe is a little harder. So hate speech can be quite hard, but we're increasingly look at sentiment analysis within text and language. That's very language specific. So you might see some more training that needs to happen between human and machine about, is that language being used actually implicitly praise and support, or is it condemnation? And then we do double review. So automatically, a certain sampling of any content that comes down is just reviewed again. And if that is coming to a different decision than the first reviewer, then it gets escalated so that we can try to self-monitor some of the errors that we might see. But again, between the rights to appeal and then self-selected, random selection of re-review. But with terrorism, we're always going to see that it's low prevalence, high risk. So it's going to be much less prevalence than a lot of other harm types, but because it has such a higher propensity for real-world harm impact, we have to take it so seriously.
Let me.
And I avoided your end-to-end encryption.
Well,
question,
yeah, I'm gonna come back on that
there,
one.
Yeah.
So that was one of the timing. There was Christchurch. There was also the announcement by Facebook of kind of a push towards greater privacy on its platforms and kind of linking Messenger and WhatsApp and Facebook a little bit more tightly, but doing so that there's greater security and encryption. I've heard criticisms that the two are somewhat related, right? Like that the push to greater privacy is related to this issue of content moderation, and it kind of the more folks are communicating in private encrypted spaces, the more it relieves Facebook of a certain burden of having to moderate that. And I'd be curious within the folks at Facebook who are working on counterterrorism policy, if that's something that you all have been talking about, and what your sense is of how privacy could impact terrorism on the platform.
Yeah, well, I would dissuade the notion that we're making it all private because we just want to be lazier. That's definitely not the case. And there's a huge cross-functional group that's questioning how you move this end-to-end. So WhatsApp is already end-to-end. What does that mean? So end-to-end means that I cannot see the content. I know that there's some people that have come out saying, oh, you can do this, and actually you can, and you can filter this. That means it's not end-to-end then. So end-to-end encryption, I cannot see the content. So that's the case with WhatsApp. The push to turn all the messaging, so not all of Facebook and all of Instagram, but messaging between individuals to push that into the privacy space is really, I think, an initiative that comes out of the ethos that started a couple years ago around fear around things like Cambridge Analytica, or fear around things like when people want a private conversation, they don't want their data being used for advertising. And that was a government push as well, of saying you need to prioritize privacy over profit, and you need to prioritize privacy because people feel they're being exploited. And that's very contradictory to other same government narratives that are saying you need to prioritize security and you should be proactively surfacing and handing this over to law enforcement. And so again, you're going to see competing voices, sometimes from the same governments, and competing legislation that sometimes contradicts itself. So I'm talking to a lot of lawyers right now about EU legislation, where the EU privacy legislation on the table seems to contradict some of the EU terrorism legislation on the table coming out from the same body. Because one says we should have to get user explicit permission to scan for content when it's in transmission. Well, that's when we do photo and video matching, is after you press publish but before it goes live. That's how you catch child exploitation imagery, to not allow for that. But then the e-privacy seems to imply that I would have to say, hey, can I scan your images? And you say, no. And I say, okay, sorry for bothering you, and go away. And so that's competing. And we're having to try to see, like, what are the carve-outs that allow us to still do our counterterrorism and child safety work, but that doesn't compete with that. The choice to go encrypted on the messaging is really, I think, from leadership. So that's all the way at the top with Mark Zuckerberg, seeing that as the future of how people want to communicate anyways. So people are moving off of platforms that they feel might be exposed publicly or that they don't feel safe at, to chat in private messaging. WhatsApp is exponentially growing in other parts of the world. Again, outside of the US, WhatsApp is just huge. That's how people want to communicate. Does that pose intense issues for things like the spread of misinformation, or the fact that if certain illegal content is shared, I won't be able to see it? Yes. So that's something that our security teams and us are having to solve around. We shouldn't disclude metadata. So the fact that there's still a law enforcement portal for WhatsApp where we use metadata, we use intel from law enforcement. It's not like that conversation stops. And we also do things like cross-platform analysis. So in theory, if your account comes down on Facebook, we also need to make sure that if you've been violating for things like child exploitation or terrorist exploitation, that also comes down on Instagram. And if there's a verified account match usage ID on WhatsApp, then that can happen too. So we shouldn't disclude other measures that don't involve us just focusing on the content. I think that came up in some of the presentations too. We're not just talking about content specific. We're looking at other indicators of misuse and abuse. Does it hamper security? Yes, that is a trade-off. And that's one that our team is constantly working with the other teams on to make sure we're not totally giving up on some of the efforts we're making. But it's not because we're being lazy about it. It's because there's a really bigger discussion about how people want to communicate what is public and what is private.
I'm glad you brought up some of the interactions you've had with, say, the EU around regulation on privacy, and the way that you're kind of balancing conflicting demands. Actually, before I go any further, what kind of relationship do you have with governments when you're when they're debating regulation? Like, is this something that is a conversation in which the conversation is grounded within both what is politically and technically feasible? Is it a conversation where one side both sides are coming to the party with different interests and vocabularies, and it's a very difficult and fraught conversation. I think from the outside, it's very hard to know. Like, there's a sense that there's things happening, but it's hard to see what kind of relationship currently exists between. I know that it would vary around the world, but like let's say in the U.S. and EU, is there a kind of a productive or a working relationship at this point? To the extent that you can comment on that, I'd love a few brief reflections.
Yeah, obviously it really depends on the government to start with. My conversations in Benin look very different than my conversations in France versus my conversations in Singapore. And so, and just people or public perception as well as government perception of what is priority, privacy, security, or free speech is really culturally specific, depending on how you've been socialized around those topics. I would say that there's a difference between some of the public policy discussions. I do think oftentimes, we have definitely gotten it wrong, and I think that we need to be transparent when we do get things wrong, but I also think that sometimes the internet is a great scapegoat. And so we need to be really realistic about, what is a political cycle of rhetoric and what's actually happening on the ground. Behind the scenes, agencies, law enforcement, we work really well with law enforcement. We're solving for the same things. Nobody wants this. I know somebody had asked me once, if you have more terrorists, that just means more ad marketing and more people is better. I'm like, no, less people will use Facebook if there's terrorists using Facebook. So net benefit, we all want to counter terrorism effectively. But I also think that we're more open to being at the table to help make sure legislation does happen, not to just try to stop it and say legislation is bad. It'd be really helpful if tech companies can be tech companies and governments can be governments. So governments do some things really well and tech companies do some things really well. And we get it wrong when tech companies become the government and the government tries to be prescriptive around tech, if I'm very honest. So that means if there's a legislation that says you have to remove terrorist content, I would love governments to define terrorist content very specifically, because if there's going to be fines against us for not removing it, I need to know it, and I need to know what list people are using, and that's a hard conversation, as we've already touched on. That is hard, but just because it's hard doesn't mean tech companies should decide it for themselves. In fact, that's a dangerous space, and it's a slippery slope, especially outside of a Western tech perspective. So we need better guidance from governments. We need legislation that understands the Internet of Things, and so that's when we're usually at the table. There's infrastructure that's happened in the last few years, like the EU Internet Forum has been a really helpful space. It's not always the case we agree on everything. In fact, that's often not the case. But it means that as legislation has been developing, or as European countries have had questions, Europol is at the table, and we're at the table, and we're updating on the numbers and what the numbers mean, and that's actually a really helpful space, so that when legislation does come out, we might not agree 100%, but it's in a much better place than if we hadn't been at the table to just try to describe what is and isn't easy and hard. Because as you mentioned, it's really hard for the audience even here today to know, for a tech company, what is easy and what is hard. Some things seem difficult, and some engineers like, I got this. And some things seem really, really simple, and I'm like, let me tell you 100 reasons why that's not simple.
I want to talk a little bit now about the Christchurch call. And I guess if you could speak a bit about the relationship or the background of that call and the way in which some different government leaders have been working with or in collaboration with some of the major tech companies around the pronouncement that was made. I think, was it 15 minutes ago or an hour ago? I mean, it just came out today. It's a major, I think, going to be viewed as one of the major moments within the history of like tech regulation, effectively, or at least with respect to content moderation. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah, so for anyone not following the other politics going on today, Nick Clegg, who now works for Facebook, strange times, is currently in Paris, and so is the Prime Minister of New Zealand, along with a range of counter-extremism and counterterrorism NGOs and tech companies that are looking at this topic. And so there was a Christchurch Declaration, which really lays out a bunch of aspirational principles and speaks directly, really broadly, to both government, civil society, and tech companies. I've been on a lot of midnight calls over the last 2 weeks around this about what's possible and where can tech companies sign on and how do we not just make it tokenistic. Because this is a moment, and I remember someone saying a few years ago, never let a crisis go to waste. Learn from it, and learn from it quickly, and don't let it happen again. And so I know from a Facebook hat, we made sure to announce some updates to Facebook Live. Obviously, the terrorist attacker in New Zealand used Facebook Live to carry out and gamify and create virality around his attack. So we've increased some of our policies to go in line with some of the requests from the New Zealand government around the fact that now, if you have certain indicators, if you have violation types around hate speech or other harmful content areas, it'll actually put you in feature blocks, so you won't have access to things like Facebook Live for a certain period of time. So that's some really practical fixes we can look to. But also, as wearing my GIF-CT hat, we developed on many midnight calls with a bunch of different tech companies a 9-point action plan to kind of be seen as an appendix to the New Zealand call so that it's prescriptive for us. And some of those things are not going to be new, sexy tech fixes to each of our companies. Each of our companies have different capacities. As soon as you get beyond 2 companies, we all operate really differently. But the difference is that we need better unity. And so it builds into the GIF-CT ethos, and it includes things like, there was a statement in the last panel around civil society engagement. I know we can debate counter speech or counter narratives till we're blue in the face, but there's some interesting research around just having tech companies help the capacity of activists and civil society voices. And what we see is that our job is not to be the credible voice to tell people not to be extremists. It's like your dad telling you not to do drugs. It's a nice thought, but it's not the credible voice. But we are there to give tools, and we are there to upscale and upskill existing civil society efforts. And that's something we can do really well. It's not to replace the offline efforts, but we should be doing that. We already do that individually as companies. There's been a lot of do-it-ourselves initiatives, but what this also does is it prescribes us doing it cross-platform. As we mentioned, terrorist exploitation is cross-platform. We should not be going as individual companies and say, here's how you do it better on Facebook, and here's how you do it better on Twitter. We need to align all of our forces and give better toolkits and advice and DIY models to civil society. So it includes things like that, but it also includes baselines around things like terms of service, explicit prevention, not being too prescriptive on the tech, because this is not just social media. Transportation apps, fintech, blockchain, storage apps, as we said, that's not about social media, but those are all exploited in different ways. So it's about getting the tech community together and having a 9-point action plan that we can work towards that just unites our voice around it a little bit more.
I'm glad you mentioned the cross-platform piece of that. I think, I guess I'd ask you to put your GIF-CT hat back on, and I'm curious for your thoughts and take on how optimistic are you that we can get to a place where there's good cross-platform action on this issue? I think one of the, historically one of the challenges has been that, each major tech company or platform, let alone all the many other minor ones which we heard about this morning, have different understandings of what terrorism is, have different kind of incentives, and I mean literally just different business models that lead them to take different kinds of actions. And as a result, there can sometimes, the tech sector as a whole cannot operate at cross purposes. And I'd be curious, based on your experience in helping to stand up the GIF-CT, whether that's something that for you is that experience is encouraging going forward, or how you see that playing out over the next coming years.
Yeah, I mentioned the 3 pillars of work that GIF-CT aims to have work streams around, or already has work streams around that we want to increasingly make more robust. And so one of those is around joint tech solutions. So that's really the by industry, for industry, self-regulatory framework that we've developed. And again, that's 14 companies. 14 is a lot, just like governments. You get 14 companies around a table, there's going to be a lot of disagreement. So actually, that's really big to have not just the big 4, so it was founded by Facebook, YouTube, Microsoft, Twitter, but also include some of our smaller, lesser-known platforms. And I say small platforms that have millions of users. So when we say small, it might just be that they're not monetized but have millions of users, or I'm saying small and they make millions of dollars every year, but they don't make $1 billion, so it's small in comparison. So our spectrum is really skewed sometimes. But I would say that with things like the hash sharing technology, larger companies tend to be net inputters to things like the Facebooks and YouTubes are going to put more content in than other companies are, just because we're the ones that have operational teams overseeing that. But then you look at the impact on a smaller company, and when we worked with Just Paste It, they were able to take down about 70,000 pieces of content based on 11,000 hash nodes that was known violating violent terrorist branded propaganda. And that's something that the head of Just Paste It was kind of in awe of. And those are pretty amazing things when you know that you have URL links being stored as a storage space for explicit terrorist content, not the wishy-washy, not ISIS toilet paper content. And then you have things like URL sharing. So increasingly, Facebook finds itself in a middle ground where the content creation is not on Facebook, but it's being used to share. That's where you're going to find your biggest audience. So oftentimes we might have indicators that something is being shared for terrorist purposes, but it's sharing a link that links to a third party, and we don't own that domain. We can't just see what that Dropbox link leads to or that archive link leads to. And so URL sharing allows us to, and this was something started by Twitter, so we learn from each other as well, share that URL directly from Facebook to the domain it exists to, not including user-specific data, not including private data, just saying, this link belongs to Dropbox. We had indicators that look wonky. You might want to review this against your own terms of service. I had to get a lot of legal feedback around things like URL sharing. But it means that Twitter built this up over the last 3 or 4 years and has shared about 10,000 links. We scaled it up in GIF-CT, and just over the last couple months, we've shared about 5,000 links. And that means that we're not telling people to take their content down. We're saying, we're flagging this to you, review it against your own terms of service, give us feedback if it's helpful for what it is. So that's the tech solution side. Knowledge sharing, people should not underestimate the basics of declassified threat assessments and basic academic information. Most tech companies do not even know where to look for that. So that's the entire point of having this global research network that we want to fund is you have great innovative tech people and they have no baseline about extremism and terrorism. Rightfully so, that's just not what they're there to do. They're there to make, Etsy and Uber, they're there to solve for different things, but they've all had exploitation. When we talked to people at Etsy at one point, and it's like they had all this Nazi paraphernalia being sold, and there are these cute girls based in Brooklyn that want to sell fairy crowns. They don't want this, and they didn't realize that that's something they would have to solve for at one point. So having forums where we can bring tech together with academic, together with policymakers to just have open and frank conversations, we shouldn't underestimate the value of that convening, because for most tech companies, they don't have baseline. And then again, that happens globally. So our partnership with Tech Against Terrorism is strategically mainly to bring new tech companies from a different region to the table, but also to engage policymakers and NGOs, and usually always make sure there's an NGO that has a human rights background. Again, in other regions, it's counterterrorism at all costs, and we need to have the human rights perspective at the table, and usually having a US voice at the table, because US free speech laws are so much more robust than other countries, is really helpful, just to put that perspective there.
I'm about to open it up to Q&A, but one last question I would have has to, you had just mentioned kind of overly aggressive counterterrorism measures by some states. And I think one of the trends that I've been noticing, and that I think many of my colleagues have as well, is that a lot of the conversation over the last 5-10 years has been focused on what bad organizations and individuals are doing online. Increasingly, we're starting to hear about and think about the bad things that states might be doing online, right? Often in the name of counterterrorism, or by empowering kind of pro-state militias or extremist groups. We saw recently that one of those kind of, I think it was actually the Myanmar military itself kind of used Facebook to carry out practices that if it was happening by a terrorist organization, I think it would be very easily flagged. And so before I open it to Q&A, I'd love to get your thoughts on how Facebook adjudicates between even just the legitimacy of different governments, or if not legitimacy, then kind of what governments, as they're working on counterterrorism, are worth working with, and others, which ones are kind of abusing counterterrorism from a human rights perspective, and how you balance those two concerns.
You saved a really easy one for the last bit, right?
Yeah.
Okay. No, I think it's an increasingly important, I know it's come up from the audience as a question a couple times as well, of, well, first of all, baseline definition of terrorism usually is that it's a non-governmental entity. Obviously, that's not always the case, even with U.S. designations of terrorist entities. We have really difficult times with things like the designation of the Iranian Guard Corps or Hezbollah and Hamas, which are considered government entities in other parts of the world. And so we are always having to say, okay, we are compliant with U.S. law, we are a U.S. company, but how that translates on the ground can be very nuanced. So what does that look like if there's a Hezbollah Lebanese election campaign and it's part of a democratic process, and are we trying to proactively surface campaign flyers? Probably that's not what we mean when we say we're robustly countering terrorism. That's not usually what governments flag to us either, but it doesn't mean that if it's flagged to us that we can allow it, because according to US law, that is a terrorist entity. Same thing with PKK. There's a lot of PKK sympathizers. We got all those music videos of badass female PKK members fighting ISIS, and they became very popular in the West, and that is a US designated terrorist entity. And so when that sort of content is flagged to us, that has to be removed because that violates US definitions of terrorism too. So we're in a difficult space. But when you get to things like Myanmar or war crimes, I think there's been some learning lessons. Some of that is around where to build your language capacities. So sometimes, again, it takes a crisis to point out that you don't have enough localized language expertise. We have to have 24/7, all over the world, language expertise for a range of subjects. And you realize very quickly, I love to be like, oh, our terrorism team in and of itself has over 40 full-time languages 24/7 just to focus on terrorism. And I said that to Nigeria, and someone's like, we have over 200 languages in Nigeria. It's like, that talking point does not land here. That makes it look less than robust, even though we'll have the main languages. And so a crisis shows when you don't have the support, especially when there's coded language being used that might aid and abet things like genocide or dehumanization language is very cultural specific. So we have to understand and work with a lot of human rights organizations. We built a lot of partnerships in the aftermath of some of the Myanmar crisis that we were looking at. Again, there's an entire team that just looks at critical countries and looks at crisis zones, because sometimes that's above and beyond just terrorism or dangerous organizations when it's state actors. But it's also making sure that we work with NGOs on the ground that can help translate some of the nuance with us and for us so that we're getting it right. Outside of terrorism policies, we don't allow for the glorification of real world harm or criminality. So if somebody's glorifying killing someone, if someone's documenting real world harm and it's to praise and support and glorify and encourage or incite it, that goes above and beyond just terrorism policies. That gets at some of these other questions as well. But we need to know how to identify that. And there's carve-outs that have to be really cultural specific. So although our policy is global, I was in Pakistan a little while ago, right when the airwaves entirely shut down. So I was stuck in Pakistan a little extra longer because we were all waiting to see if nuclear war was going to break out. And it didn't. Thankfully, I can be here today. But it was interesting. It gave me a couple extra days with NGOs. And there are different ways we can get at harm. So one thing, misinformation has come up, hinted at a couple times. We can work with NGOs to identify what misinformation leads to real-world harm and severely work to downrank it. Sometimes it's not about full-on censorship because it doesn't quite break guidelines. It's about conspiracy theories and it's very coded language, but we can work to downrank it. And I know in Pakistan, for example, we targeted 33 topics and we're able to measure the downranking of it by 80%. So like viewership and engagement around those topics went down 80% on our platforms. Things like that get to the gray, where it's not about black or white censorship or keeping it up, but actually strategically working to make sure that the real world harm comes down. Also things like, if I out you as an atheist here on the streets of DC, someone's just gonna look at me like I'm crazy, but if I out you as an atheist in Pakistan, you could get killed. And so understanding protected categories of people and understanding what religion looks like in different contexts and what leads to harm is really important.
Thank you. I want to open it up now to the audience. Colin and then Hillary. And if you could identify who you are and before you ask.
Thanks so much for your thoughtful remarks. Colin Clark from the Sufan Center. My question is, and it's not about Facebook specifically, but more broadly, is there a double standard that exists when we look at the way jihadis operate online and the way, whatever you want to call them, violent white supremacists operate online? You know, I live in Squirrel Hill, and I drive past the Tree of Life every day, and I'm reminded of Robert Bowers, and this is someone whose profile on Gab said, Jews are the children of Satan, and who owned 20-something guns. And I just thought to myself, if this guy's name was Muhammad, and he owned as much as a slingshot, and was talking about jihad online, someone would have done something, right? There would have been action. But when it's a white person, it's, well, it's the First Amendment, he can say what he wants. And it's the Second Amendment, so he could have as many guns as he wants. Is there a double standard, and is that changing?
I knew this crowd would give me really easy questions, so I'm glad I came prepared.
And when will you fix it?
And I fixed it yesterday, 2 p.m. It's done. No more problem, I promise. No, it's my original theoretical background, if we can nerd out, is on far-right neo-Nazi radicalization movements, specifically in post-communist countries, when I lived in Hungary and hung out with a lot of neo-Nazis. So I can tell you it's something that's very personally close to me, and it's something that we made sure as we were developing our own terrorist definitions, that's why it is not specific to one ideology or religion, that it is not agnostic and it looks at behaviors. And it looks at organizational structures, and it looks at indicators, so that we don't have a stereotype. The Internet of Things, there's a huge variety of how terrorism is being defined, prioritized, surfaced, and removed. There is a difference and divide between companies that are willing to come to the table. So like GiftCT has open membership. We have 14 members for Hash Sharing Consortium, but we've engaged with over 100 companies in different parts of the world that were just interested in coming and learning about baselines. And we have, another handful of companies that are applying for membership, but don't have terms of service or human rights wording, or we're helping them get to baseline with our partnership with Tech Against Terrorism. There's another side of the internet that is maybe solving for just free speech, or solving for just the ability of people to do what they want in the Internet of Things, and maybe are negligent. And so there's two parallel sides of the internet. Maybe there's a third as well, where there are platforms where it's impossible to even know how to reach them. There's not even an info at sort of way of reaching them, because they're microsites or they're just storage platforms, and it's impossible to know how you would even reach out to them in an email, nonetheless get them to the table to talk about terrorism. So that's something, wearing my GiftCT hat when we've done engagements, that's something that becomes very clear. There's also a really big difference in how if we compare these two strands of terrorism, so Islamist extremist terrorism and white supremacy terrorism, recognizing there's quite a few other strands globally that exist, white supremacy terrorism tends to be highly decentralized. So there's a lot of mixed symbols and slogans. Some of it blurs into populist rhetoric, some of it blurs into alt-right, some of it blurs into other spectrums which would not be considered illegal or against policy. But it's not like what you see with Daesh, what you see with Daesh, where people would pledge allegiance to a specific group and use a specific symbol as a group identity marker. And that was also exemplified in the Christchurch terrorist shooting, whereby the attacker used a bunch of different symbols. He covered himself to pledge allegiance to all these different icons of the far right, white supremacy across the board. He mentioned icons, everything from Breivik, terrorist, to Camus, who's the revisionist in France who talks about the Great Replacement. In fact, he stole his title, and I know Camus in France was outraged that he stole his title. There's some weird stuff where that's oftentimes considered populist far-right, but not considered white supremacy overtly, and not considered illegal by a country. In fact, I think Camus is running for European Parliament. So is Tommy Robinson. So we have some interesting figures coming up in this European election cycle. So that's harder. So it's harder for tech companies because, one, it's harder to build machine learning indicators around them. So we have built out proactive measures around hate-based organizations to surface certain symbols and slogans that we know are used quite a lot, but it's not as centrally coordinated, so you don't get that content push in the same way that you have with jihadist networks. But also for some tech companies, they're trying to do the right thing, and they might just say, hey, we use the US designation list, full stop, or we use the UN-sanctioned terrorist designation list, full stop. And that's easier for them to defend. It's harder to do a Facebook route and say, we have our own definition, does this group fit this criteria? It's a lot easier to outsource that list, but I think, as some of your research even shows, those lists are imperfect for a lot of reasons, not because they're trying to be imperfect, just because this is a really hard space. So I think that's one of the differences between white supremacy terrorist strands that we're seeing today versus some of the more traditional Islamist extremist jihadist strands.
I'm going to take, Hillary has a question, and then I think there's one in the back. Clara has a question.
Hi, my name is Hillary, and I'm a student at Georgetown University. So I have a question about cross-platform migration. To what extent do you think that the GiveCity can come up with a unified policy in order to reduce this phenomenon? And then what kind of incentives can you give to platforms that don't meet your standards in order to make a change and join the GiveCity? Thank you.
That one's really hard because we are not the internet police. And I wish we were. It's not like someone puts the Batman logo up in the sky and we have the GiveCT logo and we're like, we got this. It's meant to be by industry, for industry. It's meant to be a very civil space. It's meant to be an open door policy. So those that want to come to the door, we will help you through that door and we will help you in whatever way we can and share knowledge around it. Governments probably have a better space and role to play in incentivizing companies to come to the table around that. So it really does help when governments at least introduce the concept that by industry, for industry, self-regulatory frameworks are a positive thing. Sometimes it doesn't help when all you hear in the media is shaming social media companies. It really makes a lot of platforms I talk to not want to come to the table at all because they just feel, well, if I'm not totally on the radar, sure, I was listed in the top 10 of some academic paper of exploitation, but if a government's not talking to me about it, I don't really have to, let's not even open that can of worms because I only have 5 employees. So there's different positive incentivization structures that some of it comes from us just reaching out proactively and engaging in different regions, but some of that's also other civil society and government structures that just show that as an option and push that as a positive way forward. Cross-platform migration, GDPR and privacy laws would kill me if I just flagged a profile to something outside of the Facebook family and said, hey, do you have this terrorist? I mean, we've decided that's a terrorist. That stuff gets really hard. So whatever we're sharing in GiveCT is stripped of any privacy data. So we can share images and photos. We can share logos and hashtags potentially. That stuff is devoid of personal data. As soon as we get into the realm of sharing with other tech companies that we don't monitor or own private user data, that I think a lot of human rights agencies would probably be up in arms around that, and rightfully so, especially if we have our own definitions of what terrorism is and not government definitions that we might be using. But that's just the reality of things.
We have time for one more question in the back, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking. It's been really interesting. My name is Claire Abrahams. I was just wondering about this kind of gray area when something doesn't necessarily fall into what violates Facebook's community standards. I know sometimes there'll be an experiment whereby 2 identical pages go up and they get flagged for violating standards, and one page will be removed and another will not. And of course, human bias comes into play there. Is there any kind of training for the people who are reviewing these posts? Is there a double review system? Just wondering about the kind of human error in nature. Thank you.
Around the gray area, I mean, we really see it as if we're questioning the gray and we can't clearly pin it to our policy, we will err on the side of leaving it up. We will err on the side of free speech. Because if we can't, our policies have to be explainable, defendable, and scalable. And so if I can't, across the board, say, yes, that is or that isn't, then at scale, that's going to be problematic. So if it's in the gray, we will err on keeping it up. Again, we're damned if we do, we're damned if we don't with some of that, I'm sure of it. But I think that's the only way to not have vast abusive over-censorship. As I said, we do a natural random selection of re-review to make sure that reviewers would hit it the same every time. And if it's not, then that would be escalated further and we'd go back and see where maybe further training is needed. When it comes to machine learning tooling, we won't employ a tool unless it's at above 99% accuracy usually, because those tools are so robust. I mean, you have to think that even if you have 1% inaccuracy, in the Internet of Things that can have huge consequences. So that's why also pairing that with things like the rights to appeal, so that if we get it wrong, someone can flag to us that we've gotten it wrong, is really, really important. We also get a lot of third-party feedback. So we have infrastructure to be able to reach out as we're developing our policies. There's really hard lines that we're trying to evolve, and it's really helpful that we point to conversations we've had with NGOs or with academics to say, hey, we're not just basing this on our own echo chamber of thought. We've actually reached out to experts to vamp that up. And that came after Christchurch as well. We announced that, and this gets controversial around biases perhaps, but we announced that we recognized white nationalism and white separatism as part of our policy against white supremacy. That's not saying that all nationalism and separatism is against our policy. So there's a lot of concern there about, well, what about, is that being biased against white people? Is that being biased against the far right, if we want to call it that? But a lot of that came from huge roundtables with experts and academics from different parts of the world that were looking at how white nationalism and white separatism was manifesting online and how the coded language was being used to incite hate speech and real-world harm. And that also came with, when we talk about the gray, it's not just about censorship, it's also about a huge amount of funding towards counter-speech, alternative narratives, tooling, training civil society on how to flag things to us, getting to a baseline understanding about what trends they're seeing as well. So there's a lot of programs like the Online Civil Courage Initiative, which is just about training practitioners, or the peer-to-peer program, which goes to over 59 countries and has university students engage on challenging hate speech and extremism in a local context online. It doesn't have to be Facebook specific. So I think we can tackle the gray in different ways that don't involve pure censorship. And there's a difference in pages. When a page is removed, it could just be because you had multiple violations that you kept on abusing. It could also be that we designated you as a hate-based organization or a terrorist organization. That's different. If you come down because of multiple abuses, you've just come down. If you come back on named differently, we don't necessarily know. If you are designated as terrorist or hate-based entity, that means we would also employ recidivism, so that if we saw that page again, it would automatically be removed because it was designated above and beyond basic abuse standards.
Well,
I know that's a lot.
Thank you for all of it. I think we need to end here. Thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. If we can give a round of applause for
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.